Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of the poetry that I read in the first half of April of 2019. April is National Poetry Month in Canada, I think also in the United States, and as such I thought I'd pick up a little bit more poetry than I normally read. And the first thing that I picked up was Inhaling the Silence by Anna Yin. This is a collection that doesn't have a single overarching theme, although I suppose one could say that it looks at the day-to-day. I liked a lot of the poetry in here, although now, because I read this at the beginning of the month, it hasn't really stuck with me particularly, but I did think a lot of these were lovely. One pairing that I liked in particular was they're titled March's Rainy Curtain, which is talking about the West Lake, which is in southern China. Roam with me towards the West Lake. Upon the warm breeze, within a night, the banks turn green. Through slanted eaves, crisp bird calls and golden sun rays beam down on my river-flowing home, and so on. So very naturey. And then directly opposite that on the page is a poem called The Day Goes By, which talks about walking from Union Station to the Distillery District, which is along Lake Ontario. So I'll read part of that to you. Waiting at Union Station, clock ticks, pawns line up, mind floating at the Mill Street Brewery, dessert for free. Dashing steps, train passing home elsewhere, the veiled moon tonight upon Lake Ontario. So I thought it was funny that we got the two lake poems face to face, and I don't know if they're ordered like that intentionally, but I liked that those were paired together. And there's a lot of stylistic and form differences in here. There's a lot of free verse, there's a sonnet. There are a lot of pieces that are written to particular poets, generally to either Canadian or Chinese poets. The next book that I picked up was Beautiful Mutants by Adam Pottle. He's the same author who wrote the novella The Bus that I discussed in my last wrap-up. This is a really interesting collection of poems in that most of the poems are parts of series that deal with a specific topic, but they are for the most part woven in between each other, which does an interesting thing because I think a lot of poets will create a collection that has distinct chapter sections where the series of poetry run in order, but seeing them interwoven like this was a little more interesting. Occasionally surprising, because occasionally you go into something thinking this is a standalone piece and then it is not, it's part of something else. I think the most powerful part of this was the section that is titled The Alberta Provincial Training School for Mental Defectives, and the parts that are tied into that, which is dealing with an institution in Alberta where a lot of people were forcibly detained, but also forcibly sterilized, which resulted in lawsuits that had some publicity when that went through. A lot of the publicity was for a particular former inmate / patient who was described in her records as having an average IQ. It's kind of a reminder of how people think about the abilities and the level of agency of people with developmental disabilities, that there was such a focus on this quote-unquote normal woman going through this, whereas of course it's horrible for everyone, not just the quote-unquote normal woman. And bits of that's the section that deals with that combine very simple children's rhyme type pieces with free form poetry and also some found poetry through court statements, which I thought was really interesting. Interwoven with that is another series of poems, part of which is called Deaf Speech, which is basically the narrator character, essentially a person meditating on their experience of hearing, being hard of hearing, speech, elements of speech. I think that part gets painted as being autobiographical poetry just because Adam Pottle is himself deaf, but he has written a memoir and it's pretty clear that the stuff that the poems in here are not really as memoir-esque as I think a lot of people who have reviewed this have implied, and I think that's maybe a little bit iffy that the assumption has to be that if you're a deaf person writing about a deaf character, it must be about you. I thought that was kind of interesting on a external level. There are also two series of poems in here that are essentially stories. They're both prose poetry, one of which is about a character who is shot during a drug deal gone wrong in Vancouver and becomes a paraplegic and ends up working in a call center. And we get his stories interwoven amidst the deaf speech story and also the story of a teenager who has just lost a leg and gets involved in online fetish forums. And because all three of those are interwoven together, it makes you pay attention to it a little bit more, to kind of remember who are we discussing at this point, or who are we thinking about at this point? And there are additionally some other pieces in here that are interwoven with the stories. I thought the interweaving of the different narrative poems was really compelling, and I thought it worked. I know there are some people who feel like prose poetry is cheating. I think being overly impressed by the difficulty of creating works in a particular form is dismissive of what prose poetry can do. Like if you feel compelled to define poetry as needing to fall within really specific parameters, I think that's really limiting what you can read, write, and enjoy. Unfortunately, because so much of this is essentially storytelling, I'm reluctant to read any selections out of this because I don't think it works in isolation the way more traditional poetry where the poems exist as individual pieces. I think if you are a fan of storytelling, of narrative poetry, of prose poetry, or if you are a fan of Pottle's non-poetry work, I would definitely suggest picking that up because I thought it was very good. And finally, I read Michael Lista's The Scarborough, which without the framework that it's sold on, would be a really compelling collection of mixed classic and early 90s pop culture elements being mashed together. Unfortunately, the framework makes the content feel unearned and a little cheap. You can see the skull in the videotape on here, what the back copy says, and the way the author discussed this collection in interviews. So it's not simply the publisher marketed it this way, he definitely sold it this way himself. Is that this is a loss of innocence story based on the fact that the serial killer Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka murdered one of their victims over the Easter weekend in 1992. So that's the framework of this. And we get two poems that touch on that. There is one poem where we have the narrator character, who is presumably mostly the voice of the author, who is a 9-year-old in 1992 and hears something about a missing girl on the radio. And then later we get a piece that's set in more or less the current day, where he is an adult and is pretending to house hunt, but is actually taking pictures of what was the crime scene. The house where that happened no longer exists. It's been torn down, and he's caught by a neighbor being voyeuristic who basically knows that that's what he's doing. However, most of the poems in here aren't that. They really are kind of a 9-year-old's view of life in the early 90s in the GTA. Without the bigger framework, I would have thought a lot of that was really interesting. A lot of the poems have bits of things. There's a poem called Gold Nissan that has part of the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air theme song in the middle of it. Some of them are entirely bits of other things. There's a poem in here that's called Purgatory. If you are from Southern Ontario and you listen to radio or television ads in the early 90s, you will recognize that the entire poem is, I mean, this is found poetry. It's the Marineland jingle. The, everyone loves Marineland one. Yeah. And that's it. It's all 4 verses of the jingle, but it's called Purgatory. Now, I know some people think that's cheap. I was somewhat charmed by that. I thought it was hilarious. I mean, there's a poem called Today's Special that is a description of the credits sequence of the kids' TV series that used to be on TVO throughout the 80s and I suppose early 90s too. It just describes the credits sequence. There's a poem called Super Mario Brothers 3. A sickle of young grass beneath his hoof. How else would he love what isn't himself? Walking at night down Beatrice, I get a note from the abducted princess. It's about ghosts. If you see any ghosts, be careful. The castle where her hosts detain her is haunted. The stars are bare and won't drop super leaves into the air that could transubstantiate Italians into flying raccoons, if not stallions. I mean, it's hilarious. But even though that's fun, it doesn't earn the whole... If this were just a book of essentially reminiscences, even with the same setting of Easter 1992, even with the 2 references that it does have to the murders, I think that would have been a lot more entertaining, but because it has this framework hanging over it that doesn't feel earned, it just feels cheap. The packaging of it felt cheap, which for a lot of poetry that could have otherwise been really amusing, I think is kind of disappointing. So I didn't even bother rating that on Goodreads because the content was funny, but it's clearly not meant to be funny. It's packaged in this very grave way, and it doesn't feel like any of that is earned. So So it was disappointing just because I thought this was interesting stuff and fun stuff, but packaged in such a way that it felt cheap. In any case, that's the poetry that I've read so far this month. I have a few more collections out of the library that I'll be getting to later this month, hopefully. Have you been reading any poetry for National Poetry Month? And if so, have you been enjoying it? I'd love to hear who you've read. And if you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought of them. That's it for now. Ciao.